Hello, I'm Dr. Kenneth Goldberg, and I'm the author of The Homework Trap: How to Save the Sanity of Parents, Students, and Teachers. Yesterday I came across a radio interview with Joe Bauer, and the interview is on his blog. And I was so impressed with this interview that I wanted to comment further on it. He talks about the problem with zeros in grades and how they're very destructive for kids. And he is himself a teacher who appears to be looking to look seriously at teaching and education reform. And I've checked out his blog, and it's got a lot of interesting articles in it. But going back to the question of zeros, well, his comments tie so closely to things that I've said about homework and how zeros are so destructive in homework that I would like to use this as a springboard to talk about the psychological aspects. After all, he is an educator and I'm a psychologist, and I think it's important to understand the psychological underpinnings of what he is saying in his interview. Basically, it's important to understand what happens to the child in the face of zeros. Zeros are, in effect, what I would call a super F. Since 60 might be a normal failing grade, a zero has a mathematical weight of 2.5 times that 60. So it's not just a matter of telling the child that he hasn't done well, but it's a matter of punishing the child severely. And those zeros come at all ages. They come in elementary school, in middle school, and in high school. And although by high school the student tends to be more motivated, and if the student is motivated, is more focused on his own future, in the younger grades those zeros are really messages to the parents more than they are to the child. The parent has a better understanding of how much of an impact they can have. So they become a way of mobilizing the parent to take action with the idea that that parent can get the child to change. The reality is that generally the reason children are getting zeros at the younger ages is not because they're lazy or unmotivated, that is typically thought to be true, or that their parents are not doing a good enough job trying to get them motivated. But it has more to do with the fact that children work at different paces, and they have what I call under the radar learning problems. And because of these problems, they function better in a time-bound setting like a school that starts and stops by a clock than in an open-ending setting like home, where the 10-minute assignment is really however long it takes to get it done. So the 10-minute assignment takes 20, the 20-minute assignment takes 40, the 40 takes 80, and by the time the child reaches middle school, that child is overwhelmed. So what happens with the zeros at the younger ages, and this is before Mr. Bauer gets to see these children, what ends up happening with them is the zeros draw their parents into a parent-teacher effort to try to get the child on board. Now, if you think about it, I mean, I'm a psychologist. I work hard. I work long hours, and I go home and I sometimes take work home to do. However, it would be very destructive if I went home and the people that I love, my wife, were there telling me to do more and more work with that relief, and that I didn't get to enjoy the respite functions of my home. So what happens is the child ends up having school at home and at school, and has a demand that exceeds that of other children when you think of it in a time sense rather than in an assignment sense. So that child responds to the pressure from parent and teacher by developing negative behaviors. The child is actually learning to act out. The child is learning to avoid, to forget, to procrastinate. All of these behaviors that we're trying to get the child not to do are getting reinforced. Then what happens is if the zeros keep coming on, we have to understand something about punishments. We normally have this idea that if you reward a behavior, it's going to happen, and if you penalize it, it's going to be less likely to happen, and that makes sense in its simplest form. However, what really ends up happening is that if you continue to use a punishment that does not work, what you end up doing is you end up reinforcing behaviors that are geared to get around the punishment, not to respond to the punishment. The definition of a good punishment is actually one that is no longer used. And zeros tend to be a punishment that continues to get used despite the fact that they don't work. So what happens is that by the time the kid gets to Mr. Bauer's class, where you might expect that child to be more mature and have more expectations. The child has a very well ingrained uh, um, pattern of avoidant behavior, and that becomes very hard to break. In fact, behavioral theory will tell you that behaviors that are supported by rewards tend to be more flexible, and that if the rewards change, the individual can actually start to develop new behaviors. Behaviors that are developed out of punishment tend to be very rigid, and they don't change very easily. And the only way to change a behavior that occurs through punishment is through shaping. And what shaping means is that you give full reward for partial behavior. The child who's become homework trapped, the child who's has developed avoidance strategies, is going to have a very hard time breaking them. And if you continue to give unrelenting zeros, you're only continuing to reinforce the negative behaviors. You're almost destined to see that child fail. And the only way that child will get some reward, that child will break out of those negative behaviors, is not by just lecturing and morally saying they should, but by beginning to give reward for small displays of the behavior that you want. So if you want the child to start to learn and you want the child to start to participate, you have to reduce the assignment to a point that the child can do it, and then you have to give rewards for small amounts of efforts. And this goes very well with what Mr. Bauer says in his interview. However, that's the psychology that's behind it, and it's a psychology that's caused me to actually involve myself so heavily into the homework issue. I'm aware I'm not an educator, and in the end, I leave it to educators to figure out what techniques and strategies are most helpful for education. But if you look at the psychology, there are just certain kids that are sinking further and further into a negative cycle. They start out learning to act, well, they're children, so they act childishly, and they rebel against their parents, and they go into middle school where they can't manage the multiple demands of different teachers. So what they tend to do is they tend to work for their favorite teacher, but there's always a teacher or two whom they can't get the work done for. And then by the time they get into high school, their whole experience is very negative. And if the negative experiences cause them to lose access to school activities, for example, sports, then you're basically setting those kids into a very destructive direction, because if they can't be part of the school environment and part of the networks of their old friends, they're going to look for new people to be with. So, in any event, I hope this helps clarify a little bit of the psychology behind what has been said, and I do encourage you to look at Mr. Bowers to listen to his radio interview. Thank you very much.